In this episode of Lawyers with Game, we're talking with Mandy Petrillo, Assistant General Counsel of Fenway Sports Group, about the Boston Red Sox, the Pittsburgh Penguins, and Fenway Park. It's going to be a good one. Join us. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lawyers with Game. I'm your host, Darius Gambino. I'm an attorney with Saul Ewing in Philadelphia. My practice centers around intellectual property, and I've advised clients for over 20 years in issues related to patents, trademarks, and copyrights. I'm also a lifelong gamer, currently playing on the PlayStation 5, and you can find me on the PlayStation Network as Eagles Fan 71. With me today is my colleague from the intellectual property group, Brian Landry. Brian, you want to say a few words about yourself and your practice?
Sure. Thanks, Darius. I'm based in our Boston office, and my practice it broadly spans across all sectors of IP, including both prosecution before the USPTO, as well as contentious work in the Patent Trial and Appeal Board, Trademark Trial and Appeal Board, and federal district courts.
Thanks, Brian. And our special guest today is Mandy Petrillo, Assistant General Counsel for Fenway Sports Group. Fenway Sports Group is the owner of the Boston Red Sox, the Pittsburgh Penguins, the Liverpool FC Football Club, lots of other interesting entities. And Mandy is in charge of intellectual property. She's in charge of contracts. She's got a lot of things she's going to tell us about today. So, Mandy, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. So the first question I always like to ask our guests is about their path to their current role, because people always want to hear about, well, you know, I would love to work for the Boston Red Sox someday. How did you get to that position? We all started out of law school, in a different way. How did you make your way to this position that you're in right now?
A little bit of a long-winded story, but I'm going to keep it short. When out of law school, I ended up working for a sole practitioner doing real estate, commercial and residential real estate, a little aviation law, and corporate governance type work. And but when I was before I went to law school, I decided I had been trying to work in sports for several years. When I was in college, undergrad, I worked for a nonprofit, and I realized that you could actually work in sports for a living. And I didn't, that was the end of it for me. So as soon as I graduated from Arizona State, I tried to find a job in sports, realized I didn't have a network, didn't find a job in sports. So I worked in events. And then I moved to California with some girlfriends, again, tried to work in sports, didn't have a network in California. So I did a sales role, which is actually really great. Fast forward to become a business lawyer, and having that sales experience was actually really helpful. So what I realized is something more needs to be done in order for me to achieve this goal. So I decided to move back to Boston, where I'm from, and go to law school here, build a network here, and try to work in sports here. And, being one of the biggest sports towns in the country, who knows? Sky's the limit, right? I wasn't sure if I would ever achieve that, but that was the goal. So I decided to go to Suffolk Law, and I spent, while some of my classmates were working at firms and doing all sorts of legal jobs, I was doing all sorts of sports-related positions, legal or non-legal, and just spent a very purposeful 3 years networking and doing internships in various areas of the sports. I had met, actually it was for a class of mine, I met the then Assistant General Counsel of the Red Sox, and her and I took her to coffee, did an informational interview, and just stayed in touch with her. And when I was a year out of Suffolk, the Red Sox were looking for a senior paralegal, and she remembered me and gave her my resume. She brought me in for an interview, and the rest is history. So I started there as a paralegal. A few years later, I was elevated to a legal operations role, and then I was received the counsel position a few years after that, and been there since 2008.
That's a great story. And I think that's fantastic advice for anyone who's looking to get into the sports world. It's not necessarily the legal jobs that you had, right? It's the connections that you made in some of those non-legal jobs that led you to the point where you could get that job. So
Yeah.
really interesting stuff. Brian?
Yeah, thanks. So, love to hear about your daily responsibilities. What kind of legal matters are you handling day to day?
Sure. So I'll start by saying I don't do player contracts because usually people want to know about that first. So I work on the business transaction deals. So I work for, as Darius mentioned, I work in FSG for the FSG Boston, and under FSG Boston is the Red Sox, Fenway Sports Management, which is the sales marketing arm of the Red Sox, and the other companies actually. And I also work for Nesson, New England Sports Network. That's our regional, the Boston Bruins and the Boston Red Sox regional network. So most of the time a lot of times I'm negotiating, reviewing, drafting advertising agreements, sponsorship agreements for the Red Sox. I also work on all of our marquee non-baseball event deals. So the Winter Classic we've had come to Fenway in 2010 first, and then again this past winter. We've done some other like major events like Frozen Fenway, football at Fenway. Anytime we're doing a marquee event, we try to do other similar events that go in conjunction with that. We have our second annual bowl game coming up this December with a partnership with ESPN. We decided to have a Fenway Bowl, so I worked on that. So not only with the partner, whoever, like in that case for the Fenway Bowl, in that case it was ESPN, but also on all the ancillary documents. So whether it be vendor agreements, services agreements, sponsorship agreements for that particular event, waivers, credential back language, you name it, it's all has to be memorialized, and myself and my team work on that. In addition to the business transactions, I also work on all of the IP matters. So I manage the IP for all of our companies on the Boston side. So it's a little different, baseball and non-baseball. So for Major League Baseball is the agent for all of the clubs to enforce all of our marks. So major like if we're going to come up with a new logo or a new slogan, we vet that. We'll do our own kind of clearance memo, and then we submit it to baseball. They approve it, and then they register the marks for us and then enforce the mark. So we provide them with specimens of use over time, and they'll ensure that they're defending our marks on our behalf, which is great. Non-baseball stuff is all us. So we work on, creating the logos, clearing the logos, registering the logos, and then making sure that we're, keeping those registrations up to date.
Yeah, that's a lot to handle for sure. I don't know how you do it all, but
we have a good team. We have a very, very good team.
I wanted to just ask you, I mean, we like to talk about legal issues on the podcast, to the extent that you can talk about, one or two kind of more difficult legal issues that you faced in your time there, and how you overcame those. I think people would love to hear about that.
Sure. So not that anyone wants to hear about COVID, but COVID really threw everyone for a loop, especially when you have, as we call it, butts in seats for 81 home games a year, and you no longer can have people sitting close to each other. So that was a real challenge. For the first time in my career, I looked intensely at force majeure provisions and spent a lot of time trying to renegotiate all of our sponsorship agreements in light of some brands that their deals were really focused around in-park attendance and people consuming their products and seeing their signs. And so we ended up, thankfully, we have an incredibly business-friendly organization, and we value our partnerships with our corporate partners. So we were able to renegotiate all of our deals, which meant that we had 160 amendments to write for just to try to make it fair and try to take everyone on a case-by-case basis based on how businesses were doing and what value they were getting out of the reduced capacity situation or the canceled games. So that was a huge challenge, and couple that with like having two kids at home and not being able to go anywhere. That was just a mad time. I think a lot of us can have that same feeling. And then on the back end of, or middle of COVID, back end of COVID, we had a lockout. So again, I'm looking through all of our agreements on whether or not we've agreed to any sort of work stoppage language, what happens in the event of a lockout. So there was leading up to the lockout, and then trying to again renegotiate some of those deals so that we were making our partners whole when they were luckily only a couple weeks of the season were delayed. So luckily we didn't have to do too much. But I said at the beginning of COVID, like if we have a lockout at the end of this, like I'm all done, right? This is not going to be good. So we made it through that. But that was, that was challenging because you try to be fair, but some of the agreements we had the leverage. So it was taking the business friendly approach. Like we're not going to hold you to this, even though you're not getting the value of your bargain, even though the contract says you can, even though contract might give us the upper hand. So it was, it always helps to negotiate with folks when you're being fair to them. And that's where, so luckily we were able to kind of get through it, and we're past it now. And now I take all the COVID language out of my contract. I don't want to see it again.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because we heard that. I've heard that from a lot of clients over the last couple of years. We always put these force majeure or act of God provisions in all of our agreements, right? And they never get used. Nobody ever looks at them.
You don't even look at them. You don't even look.
Right. And now all of a sudden there is an act of God, right? There's something that we're going to have to look at this language and find out if it really covers what we intended it to cover. And so that's a really interesting one for me, and I'm glad you were able to work through and overcome that. So, Brian?
Yeah. So it seems a little bit less of a sea change relative to COVID, but we're coming up on a year since Massachusetts legalized sports gambling back in August 2022. Love to hear about how that all fits in, both within Major League Baseball, which of course spans all sorts of different states that have different approaches. What latitude does Fenway Sports Group have to partner with daily sports companies like DraftKings or FanDuel?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Luckily, Massachusetts has legalized sports betting, so that makes things a lot easier. I mean, for a little while there, we were hoping to have deals with sports betting operators, but we really couldn't do much except for the daily fantasy folks. So the DraftKings was our sponsor for a while, still is, and so in 2000, and I want to say, I think it was 19, and I'm sorry, I forget the exact year, but MLB changed its policies based on other states. So clubs are now permitted to do deals with sports betting operators, but there are some pretty strict guidelines that have to be complied with before that can even happen. So all of those sponsorship agreements have to be reviewed and approved by MLB. They all have to contain the certain representations and termination rights, basically related to like the integrity of sports betting. The companies that we do deals with have to be approved gaming operators under MLB's rules. And once that happens, they need to kind of ensure that the club isn't being basically at the end of the day, we're trying to make sure that the clubs aren't stuck that we're not stuck in an agreement when a licensed sports betting operator loses their license or something kind of bad happens, which causes them to lose their status with MLB. So MLB controls who's the approved gaming operator. And these are operators who have deals directly with MLB, have to use MLB's data, et cetera. And then were then permitted to do deals. So once Massachusetts legalized sports betting, we then were able to work with companies like MGM and BetMGM we've had a long deal with MGM, and to open up their category and give them the sports betting category as well now. We do have a daily fantasy deal with DraftKings as well, and there will probably be one other that will come on board at some point soon.
One of the other things we always like to talk about on the podcast, Mandy, is video games. And I know you said you're not a gamer anymore, but that you were a huge Mario fan and you loved the Super Mario Brothers movie. So did I. So did my whole family. It loved it, actually. And so I wanted to ask you a couple of gaming related questions.
Sure.
First, in terms of name, image, likeness rights, we're hearing a lot about the return of things like the college football video game franchise from EA. Now that college athletes can grant their rights in their likeness. So first question, how has that impacted your day to day? And then the second part of it is, I understand that Fenway Sports Management is getting into the video game world with placing advertisements inside of metaverse games like Roblox. So can you give us a little detail on what's going on there as well?
Sure, sure. So the first part, I mean, the NIL rule changes does not impact me personally or professionally because I'm not working in the college space. However, I did teach sports law for the last 4 years, and that was probably my extent of my following all the NIL changes, because it's just really been a fascinating kind of story, and how college athletes are now able to monetize through endorsement deals. So with gaming, well, first of all, as you know, it depends on whether a college will recognize an esports athlete as an athlete, and once that happens, then now the NIL, now that athletes or student athletes are allowed to or able to enter into deals where they're using their name, image, likeness in connection with a product or to endorse a product. This should, so long as the college athletes are, or the esports athletes are being considered athletes at the school, this opens things up for them. And on the flip side, if they're not being considered athletes, this doesn't impact them at all, because they're then still able to go out and grab these endorsement deals. And you can tell me if I'm wrong in there, because you're better versed in this than I am.
You got it.
So I do think it's fascinating, because most of the big branding has been in connection with tournaments, in connection with teams. And now you have these doors opening up for some of these like really skilled athletes who may not have otherwise gone to college, and now are deciding, hey, I'm going to go to school, I'm going to get a degree, maybe I'll get a scholarship, but I'm also able to monetize my name and, maybe get free product. And, in the esports world, you can imagine that can be pretty lucrative, you would think, if you're getting, all of your product for free from whoever it is, your PlayStation 5s and your PlayStation 6. I don't know when that comes out, but so I think that's really cool. And I think it, as esports becomes a more common sport at colleges across the country, you'll see more of these deals happening. That's my guess. Okay, so on the other side, recently FSM, so Fenway Sports Management is this, we've always called it the sister sports marketing arm of the Red Sox. They also sell the Pittsburgh Penguins, which is FSG purchased the Penguins a year and a half ago. They also, and when I say sell, it means sell advertising in connection with these different sports properties. They also sell Liverpool Football Club, who FSG purchased back in 2010. They're also selling, we did an endorsement deal for LeBron James. They're also selling LeBron James name, image, likeness in connection with endorsements. So FSM is a sales arm and does a couple other things, but primarily they're a sales arm. They also sell for the Red Sox. So a lot of my sponsorship deals come from FSM sales representatives, and then we draft those agreements on behalf of the club. So FSM was recently, we recently did a deal with Livewire, who's a third party. They're essentially a company that secures third party sponsors to be placed inside video games. So, or the metaverse games, sorry. And again, not super well versed on this. You can say it better than me. So now FSM is selling to some of our current partners and new partners to see if there's an interest in putting their branding within, a game like Roblox.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's extremely interesting. It's a whole new area of exploration for advertising. There was a story about, I think it was Burger King or some, well-known US brand that actually bought a small soccer club so that when FIFA came out, they could advertise inside the virtual stadium in FIFA, the soccer game. So, I mean, there's so many different opportunities there.
Yes.
It's really, really interesting. And so, yeah, really cool stuff. Brian?
Yeah, thanks for sharing on the FSM angle. Love to know what's on the horizon for Fenway Sports Group to the extent you can share any exciting things coming down the pipeline.
Yes. So one thing that's I'll talk about the gaming thing after because I think that's more interesting. But for me personally, this is great for our company. This is excellent. We just got a massive real estate development project approved by the Boston Planning and Development Agency, and it's like a $1.6 billion project called the Fenway Corners, and it's going to basically create this environment around Fenway Park that's similar to what you see at the Atlanta and some of the other really cool newly developed facilities. The Penguins are going to be doing something similar as well around in the Pittsburgh area. So really trying to make Fenway this kind of like entertainment complex that you see. I mean, the TD Garden has actually done a beautiful job of doing something similar. Whereas there used to be nothing except for an overpass next to the garden, and now it's like this really cool hotels and clubs and restaurants and everything. So that's the goal. It's very exciting. It's going to take a while to build, but personally, they're building us a new office space, which being in 100 and however many year old ballpark, it'll be a great thing to have a new building. so we'll kind of hold our breath until that happens. But that's been a very good. That was just approved in July, so that's a huge step forward for the company. This I'm not quite sure if this is actually esports, but I think it eventually may be considered esports. Is the PGA Tour put out has announced a Tomorrow Golf League and the TGL, and Fenway Sports Group just purchased the Boston team. So far there's an LA team. There's going to be 6 teams total. The concept is that there will be 3 professional golfers on each team. There's a facility being built down in, I believe, Jupiter, Florida, where the golfers will go in and actually create this like live action performance. And then it will be compiled with this kind of like data rich virtual course with this high tech environment where they'll basically compete against each other, and the area teams will compete against each other. The launch date for this is January of 2024. The complex is supposed to be built. All the teams will be in place by then. But in connection with the acquisition of that team, I've had the opportunity to advise our business stakeholders on some of the IP. So developing the IP, trying to figure out, helping them navigate the process. The TGL, the league itself, is going to, as you see with a lot of kind of grassroots leagues, they're owning all of the IP for all the teams, and they will register all the trademarks and logos of all the teams and enforce and keep a watch over those and enforce on behalf of the team. So the teams themselves are kind of creating the creative and coming up with the names, and then we'll run them by the TGL for approval. And then once that happens, keep on the lookout. In the next few months, we'll have an actual team name and a team logo. Hopefully sooner than that. But
Yeah, no, that sounds really cool. I've never heard of anything like that before. A mixture of like live golf with virtual golf. So I'm interested to
yes,
see how that will work out. But it's definitely, I would say it's in the realm of esports.
yes, I would say so.
Well, that's all the time that we have for today on Lawyers with Game. Keep in mind that this series is intended to be a very general discussion of legal issues. It is not intended as actual legal advice. If you need actual legal advice, please reach out to us. We'll be happy to help you. If you have any questions about any of the topics that we discussed, drop them into the comments and we'll try to answer them for you. I really want to thank Mandy Petrillo for coming on with us today, Assistant General Counsel for Fenway Sports Group, in charge of the Red Sox, the Penguins, Liverpool FC, you name it. She does it all. So thank you, Mandy, for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute
Absolutely.
pleasure.
And thank you to my co-host, Brian, too, for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you both.
So we'll see you next time on Lawyers with Game.